Hello everybody, it's Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and happy holidays! Today we are going to be tackling what's new in the update to 2024, which is the 0.2 update. So why don't we dive right on in? Let's begin with simulation improvements. Now, what does that mean? Sort of across the board, in this new version, there are going to be speed enhancements and just improvements to the way the simulation scene runs. In order to show off some of it, I'm going to need to open up scene files in this new version and in the previous version. What do we got here? I've got a rope connected to a cylinder, to a rope to a cylinder, just using rope tags, rigid bodies, and using these lovely connectors. Now let's open this up also in the previous version and show what it looks like here first. Now I have run into this issue before. If I hit play, you can see that's running, but this bottom one, this bottom cylinder is like shooting all over the place, completely out of control. I honestly have no idea why. Playing with different settings, different dampening settings, different sub-steps could improve the situation, but I was never quite sure why that was happening. Now, in the new version, exact same scene file, hit play, and you'll see that that is working nice and super smooth, exactly the way you would expect it to. Now, across the board, I'm finding that every scene file is working just as well or better, but I can't really list what was fundamentally changed, but I just seen nice improvements sort of across the board there. Moving on, here's another tweak that was made. Again, we need to A/B test this one. So in the previous version, if we open this up, here is a setup with a cloner. If I hit play, you can see that each of these is randomly scaling. Let me apply, rewind, and apply to the cloner our rigid body setting and hit play, and we're going to see some problems. They fall to the ground properly, but you'll see that these are just passing right through each other. Not only that, if I rotate my camera around, you're going to see that they are hovering in the air and passing straight through the ground. Essentially, all of the simulation stuff was not respecting the scale of the object. Hitting play, you see they're just passing right through each other. So in the new version, let's also apply a simulation rigid body and hit play, and we'll see exactly what we would be expecting. We've got the cubes properly sitting on the ground, scaling up, bouncing, pushing each other away, so just working the way we'd expect it to. I actually never bumped into this one while I was playing with any of the 2024 stuff, but it's good to know that this is now implemented. Next up, let's open this one and go to the previous one and open as well. I've got a little bit of a ball in the cup situation here. If I hit play in the previous version, you're going to see that this is starting to shoot all over the place. Gravity is not working, and it's just zipping all over. Again, I was never quite sure why this was happening. Let's jump into the new version. Exact same setup, hit play, and now you see it's perfectly falling down like it should be. Now, one small issue, and something I'd love to see change in the future. If I hit play, see how that rope looks like it's lagging behind the ball, like it's not properly connected? But you'll see if I pause that it is properly connected. So it's like a viewport refresh issue, and that really, really throws me off as I'm playing around. But let's hit play, grab the actual cup here, and start moving around. Let's see if we can actually catch the ball. I actually never have. Nope, never successfully got that to be caught. But yeah, just working a lot better overall. Again, A/B testing, you can see the differences there. Next up, I'm going to open up this damping scene file. Now, this is a file I pretty much made for a couple versions ago. If I hit play, you're going to see that I'm doing this cool inflation technique using cloth. So here's a cloth, and we are applying different pressures using a vertex map, which is being driven by the spherical field. So it's just randomly traveling around. You can see all this jiggly, wiggling, inflating setup. Now, so if you want to control the damping here, like how much energy was getting drained out from the system, you'd have to hit Control or Command D, go to your project, simulation settings, and you had a single damping slider. That's all you had. And that's the only thing you'd control was universal, and that would apply to rope and cloth and rigid bodies. But now, inside here in cloth, you can see that we've got an individual damping. We can override that. So again, let's just get a baseline here. You can see we get all these letters kind of uniformly being really jiggly, wiggling all over the place. So now let's jump inside them all and say override, and it'll make the first one 0, and the next one let's do 5%, the next one let's do, I don't know, 20%, we'll do 50%, and the last one, I don't know, let's do 100%, just see what that does. And now hit play, that's the only thing that changed was the damping on there, and then we get that same inflation technique, but now all the energy is being drained out for them. So you can see in this middle one, still pretty jiggly, but these where there's a much larger percentage, like over here, what did we do on that one? We did 50%. That drains out very quickly. Now as this wiggles around, you can see barely, yeah, this one's super jiggly still, even 0%, so it's gonna be even less. But then this one fading in. The ability to individually control these is actually really important. It's been kind of driving me crazy, and it's definitely been a request I have. So seeing this integrated is really, really great. Now, that's on cloth, but it's not just on cloth. It's also integrated into ropes, and it's also integrated into the rigid bodies. So here we've got a giant stack of cubes. Some of them are intersecting. Go and add a new simulation rigid body. And inside here, you will also see that we get, let me twirl that down, we got a damping, and we can override. Now, what's cool about this is we have a linear and angular dampening. So let's hit play and just see what it looks like by default. Some intersect, they're all falling. You see as they tumble into this pile, they are crashing, bouncing, they're spinning around, tumbling around. So now let's say override, and that should pretty much be the defaults, whatever it is in the general scene file. But now we can do things like let's crank up our angular dampening. So I'm gonna say 100%, why not? So now I'm saying that all the energy of the rotation should get drained out. That doesn't mean they can't spin. This isn't like a follow position or follow rotation type of thing. It's just saying that they don't have any continued spin. And you see how much more vertical and calm the overall simulation is. But if I drop that down to 0, we should see these rotating and tumbling, rotating everywhere. So stylistically, like a big difference we can make. And then of course, linear for our actual speed, we can individually slow down this particular object to any speed that we like. Now, one thing that is different about the simulation system, and I kind of liked better in the old bullet simulation, is here we have to apply all of our simulations on the cloner instead of the child. What that means is we're a lot more limited in building some slightly more advanced rigs. So for instance, let's say, here's a setup I'd like to do. Let's say we have 0, 0 on this tag. So I'm going to move that onto the cube and then duplicate that. And on this one, I'll say I want to have 100, 100. Actually, let's not go quite that high. I'll say for linear movement, I'll say 50%. Okay, cool. Now we've got two different objects getting cloned. And actually, we can even set the cloner. Yeah, I've got the cloner set to blend. So it's trying to blend between those two different settings. But if I hit play, unfortunately, you see nothing happens. The cloner, simulations can only happen with a cloner if the tag is on the cloner, which means everything gets the same setting. However, we can make the cloner editable here. And now we've got all the different cubes, and each one that does have its own unique blend of those parameters because we're in blend mode. So having done that, if I zoom out and hit play, we're going to see that some of these are super smooth. They're super quick to be able to fall, and the other ones are slowly transitioning into a state in which they can't. So it's pretty cool to be able to do that type of blending or apply this on different objects. This is just using different dampening on the linear and on the angular. So that works really well there. But like I said, I'd love to see this type of thing be able to work directly on the individual objects and not have to be on the cloner stack. And lastly, as far as this rigid body, soft body stuff is concerned, we've got one more file to check out. Drag this in. So this is actually a scene file I've been building for the previous version of Cinema, and I was having a lot of trouble with it, so I ended up not demoing it. So I've got some elements here, but they're really big. I didn't put this in the proper scene scale, so you can see how big they are. But at least it's a more interesting shape. On this cloner, I'll right-click and say Simulation Rigid Body. And even right now, in their default setting, we're going to see some of the problem. If I hit play, you're going to see them all collide with the ground and slide out of the way. It's like, okay, well, obviously they need more friction. So let's give it a bunch of friction. So we'll say like 10. It's pretty high. So rewind, hit play. We'll see them fall, tumble on the ground. But you see they're still sliding along. It's like, okay, well, let's do 10 times as much friction again. Let them fall again. And pretty much no different. They just keep on sliding and sliding and sliding. And they pretty much never want to stop. Well, we got a couple of new settings now. Inside of the Dynamics tab, we've also got this new Deactivation tab. Now, we've got our linear and angular velocities, which is something we've had for a while, but now we've got this new sleep strength and timer. I'm going to try and get really specific about what these are doing. Pretty much, we're saying, well, in the past, it was like, okay, as these were moving, were they moving less than the linear velocity? So like less than that distance, I think in a frame, maybe in a second, I'm not entirely sure. And it also had to be moving less than that angular velocity. And if it was less than those, it would fall asleep. But now we've got more control over it with this timer. So what this is saying is if at any point in the last 60 frames, if they were above that threshold, so faster than that, then it could stay alive. So it has to be essentially going so slow for like 60 whole frames. So if I hit play here, that's what's happening is these are moving a good amount over the course of 60 frames. But now we can do something like say, hey, over the course of 5 frames, I want that to be the threshold. So now when I hit play, you'll see them start tumbling and they settle in. But as they start settling in, you see they actually are starting to stop. So it took them a while, but we can change these settings even further. Like we could put a larger angular threshold. So let's jump this up to, I don't know, let's say 30 and even 30 degrees rotation. And now rewind, hit play, and now we'll see them collapse and they'll fall, but way more quickly they settled in. So our ability to do this shorter timer is actually giving us a lot of control over the way those work. In addition to that, we've got the sleep strength. So what is that doing? Well, once our different objects have fallen asleep, and let's let them fall asleep, it is what is the threshold in which they can wake up again? And this is based on that same linear and angular velocity thresholds. So it's a multiplier on that. So in order to show this, what I'm going to do is you can actually go above 100%. So I'm going to type in like 1,000%. So we're saying that these things, once they fall asleep, they're really asleep. So I'm going to activate this sphere here, hit play. I'm going to see that collides with it and they don't wake up. But if I change the setting to be pretty small, let's do a really small number like 5%, it's saying, hey, as long as, and actually let me be really clear about this, if a sphere or if anything collides with this object, if that object were to move, how far would it move? And is that at least 5% of the threshold? If so, it re-wakes up. So now let's activate a second sphere with this lower threshold active and hit play. And now you see as that collides, that everything it's touching, it actually wiggled a little bit. I was kind of hoping that would fall down off to the side. So let's run that again. I think I want to move that sphere a little bit further this way just to see it tumble a bit more. So let's let these elements settle in. They will deactivate pretty quickly. And then I can activate this sphere, let it tumble, and you see everything that it strikes will reactivate. Now, they're not going to move too much because there's very heavy friction and they're deactivating again, but they did reactivate really easily. So important variables there. We got all those nice new improvements here with deactivation and damping and a controlling scale and the overall simulation enhancements. So let's go and move into our next section, which is going to be pyro enhancements. It's going to be pretty quick to get through this pyro stuff. Opening it up, what do we got? This is, actually we're going to want to A/B test this in between the new version and the old. So here's the old version, and this is running a cloth simulation, pretty straightforward. I've got this attractor and some turbulence. It's kind of crumpling up this ball of cloth. Now, let's right click on that and say simulation pyro emitter. If I hit play, you can see that from the surface, we are now emitting from the pyro object. And it's doing a fine job. It's running the simulation, and it's creating fire and smoke from the entire surface. Now, let's jump into the new version and also add on that same pyro emitter and hit play. And actually, before we hit play, you'll see under emission type, we have a new type called dynamic geometry. So if I turn that on, it is now going to be doing a better job of respecting the simulations that come before it. So if I hit play here, we're going to see that it's going to look a little bit different. It's pretty much the same thing, but something feels different. So let me point out exactly what that is. If we go back over here in the previous version, hit play, you're going to see that the geometry is sneaking through. You can see that we can see that plane pushing up through the smoke and through the fire. If we jump into the new version and hit play, you can see it's doing a much better job of emitting correctly on that surface. So it just looks way cleaner, and it is a significant improvement right there. And the other pyro feature that's been added, open this up. If we create a brand new sphere, I will right click and add a simulation pyro emitter. Inside of your pyro output, under pyro scene, under pyro, I know there's a lot of settings here. Let's even twirl these up. Underneath our density, our color, our temperature, and our fuel, there's some new settings. Let's just do temperature and density for now. And the new setting is this time scale. So we have a density time scale, we have a temperature time scale. So right now they're all operating on the world time scale for pyro. If I hit play, you can see that it's just playing through. But now we have the ability to change those. So let's just take a look at the way this looks by default. You can see all the fire and smoke seem to be moving very much together. If we go and change our density timescale to something slower, like 50%, now the smoke, its time multiplier is half that amount. So it's still reacting to the fire, but you can see that the smoke kind of feels like it's getting a little bit left behind. It's not as reacting as much as the fire. And if we were to do the opposite, let's put that back to default and drop our temperature timescale down. Now I feel like the smoke is going to feel a little bit more dominant in the simulation. And that's not changing anything except for the time scale. I haven't thought about too much. I mean, it's kind of like, allowing those things to calculate at different speeds. I haven't thought of it too many practical applications for that, but I always like having more control over the simulations. Moving on, Here's going to be a nice simple one to explain, but nice and powerful and easy to use. It is the new and improved key reducer. Let's open up a new scene file, and I'll just move into our assets browser, which, by the way, there's another new assets browser button. I think this is the third time in 3 versions that we get a slightly tweaked button. So inside here, let's just go find our motion capture information, and here's all these different types of motion capture. Let's middle mouse button click so we can see all of them listed. Grab something that just has a lot of motion. So this cheering one, I know that has a lot of motion. Inside of that, if I play, you can see we've got all this animation, lots of stuff going on. Open up our timeline. Let's pull this up so we can see a whole bunch of it. And move into F curve. And if I hit Control A, you're going to see we select all of those keyframes. So every single frame, every single different joint, all of its rotation, all of its position is being recorded. That is a lot of information. It is not very clean. It's not very controllable. Now, actually, it might be kind of fun to open this up as well in the previous version. So let me open up the older one and also go into our assets browser, go into motion capture, and grab that cheering again. Let that pop open. Cool. So if I move inside of our timeline here, again, we see all this crazy stuff happening. If we go into F curves, okay, select all. Under functions, you're going to see there's a key reducer, but we're not allowed to click on it. In order to see that, we have to go into our keyframe view or our dope sheet, click on that and go to functions. And in there, you now see we have a key reducer, and we just have 2 different settings. We got our reduction and our inflection, whatever that means. I'm not quite sure, but we would be able to like increase that, and you can see like keyframes are disappearing, but we have to do it in this view. And every time I click and drag, it's kind of destructively getting rid of all of that. Okay, let's move into the new version. Here we are in our F curves, and I can go to functions, and you can see that we can now get the key reducer while we are here in our F curves. Clicking on that is a very similar menu, but it's different in one important way, and that is I can change these values and we can see it interactively. So every time I click, it's not destroying it. So I can click and modify this, and look, we can get very, very clean curves here. And we got magnet. We can modify these settings, move it around. Pretty much, I just slide these around until I get something that looks really nice and seems controllable. So reduce this as much as you want. You go crazy, and we can just do a little bit. Even just doing like 1 or 2%, I guess a little bit more of that, but jumping up to like 5%, 10% is going to reduce a lot of keyframes out. Once you hit OK, it will bake that down. But now we can hide those F curves, hit play, and I still have my animation, but with way, way fewer keyframes, hopefully making it way more controllable for you to modify the animation. So pretty straightforward to use, but a very powerful tool indeed. Next up, we got a rapid fire, doing some random tidbits all over the place. I'm just going to list a couple of these things out. First of all, we've got a small update to like the Python code inside of Cinema. So it should be doing a better job of dealing with malicious Python code. So along those lines, I've never heard of any problems with it, but apparently that is now a thing. You now have the ability to import your GITF file format. It's going to be able to be importing the position, rotation, and scale attributes when you're importing a file. Not something I'm terribly familiar with. One thing that I actually didn't know, let me pop this file open. You'll see I've got a text object and a text spline, and I'm using Space Grotesque, and I'm using my favorite lemon milk. Under Window, there's an entire manager I didn't know about called the Project Asset Inspector. And it pops open this manager here. And in addition to all the other assets, it will now be listing out the different fonts that are being used in your project file. So if you're preparing to send something over to a client or somebody else you're working with or a render farm, this is a good way of finding out what is linked, what might be broken. So inside of here, what's cool is you get all the different information that you might need. But in addition to that, if you double click on the actual object icon here, it'll pop open the attribute manager. And here you can just go and quickly change this to something else that would maybe actually be on your computer and correct things very quickly that way. So yeah, Project Asset Inspector. I'll have to look into that more because I just did not know about it. Now, something I am very excited for is we've now got a new substance in Redshift. Opening up a brand new scene file, I'll move to my assets browser and under model, search for the word plane. And we got this cute little toy plane. I will open that up. Let's zoom on up to that plane, and you can see it is all set up, ready to go. Now, what I would like to do is actually drag my folder over here to show you. And let's open up our material manager. if I drag this wood maker material that I made, you see it's an sbar file, it's a substance designer file. I can drag that directly into my material manager, and it is going to make a brand new Redshift material. And inside of it, you can see it is linking directly to that substance material. Now, what's really, really cool and powerful here, first of all, it automatically made it, set the bump, did everything we needed to. Inside of the material, I had spent a whole bunch of time, and you'll see over here, I made this material way back in 2017, so it's pretty old at this point, but I spent a bunch of time making in Substance a bunch of different parameters, which actually get imported into Cinema. So if I replace this plywood, holding that Alt, I can automatically override that material so I get all the proper mappings. And select the material, say viewport, I would like to see it at a higher resolution. If I select my material under Substance 3D Material, I get all of those different properties. And I spent a lot of time, and I would definitely design this differently today. I've got a lot more experience building interfaces. But we can, the idea of this tool was to make a whole bunch of different materials, any type of wood I might want. So we can change the type of wood to, let's say, a dark oak. And automatically, the Substance is going to generate a new material based on that. So over here, I can do things like completely change my random seed and get a completely brand new material applied there. And I've got all these different properties like age, which is going to drive some of the bump. We got grain, how visible the different knots are. We can change the knot scale, sharpen, contrast. We got like all these different distortions, the base variation, the grain scale. I could change all of these and get a completely different looking bit of wood. And let's change this to, say, a bleached oak with a different seed. And instantly, I have an infinite number of different wood materials that would never, well, they're perfectly tileable, make them over and over again. I can change the scale here. So a very fun addition. And now we can just import that directly into our Redshift materials. So very exciting. And maybe I'll spend a little time going back into Substance Designer because it was really fun making those different materials when I had been working on those back in the day. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. Let's reset our layout and moving on to the branch spline modifier. Now, this one is exciting because it is the newest tool from Rocket Lasso that should be included in your Maxon One subscription. Opening up a brand new file, if you weren't already familiar, although I've been trying to spread the word about this a bit, if you move into your assets browser, and especially if you move under, and we do say all actually, and search for the word Rocket Lasso, you're going to see a whole bunch of different example files. And if we scroll down here, you're going to see a bunch of different tools. These are different node-based modifiers. So these work inside of Cinema 4D. Now, the important thing to note is some of these modifiers are available for Cinema 4D subscriptions, and some are Maxon One subscriptions. So you can see we get this little O for the Maxon One subscriptions. I don't decide that. Now, the newest modifier just launched, and it's my favorite one that's launched to date. Now, how do these actually work? Well, you create a spline of some sort, and here's like a different example. Here's some text. Let's say 2024.2, put it in the middle. And a different modifier we have is something like the break spline modifier. So I can drag that in as a child. It's probably going to have to download. It gets loaded in, and now you can see that it's broken parametrically like a deformer. It's broken apart our spline into all these different little pieces. And we can break it apart in different ways based on the count or the length, or let's say based on the angle. So only when there's a very sharp angle, we can lower that. So now every time we get a bit of an angle, it's going to create a break at those points. So that's very powerful, and I really like playing around with a bunch of these different modifiers. Another good one, and this one is actually available to anybody who's got even a Cinema 4D subscription. We've got the trim spline. If I drop that in, we can do something simple like erase out your splines, like them as a single giant segment or per segment, and erase out all of them. So a lot of power and fun to be had with all these different modifiers. But we're going to be talking about the new branch spline modifier. This is not the final icon, still waiting for that to come out. But to begin with, we need some sort of base spline to work from. So I'll make a helix spline, and I'll lay this flat on the ground, say a start radius is 0, end radius is 0, and we end up with this perfectly straight line traveling up. Excellent. So that's pretty much what I want. I will now grab the new branch spline modifier and drop it as a child. And the instant that I do, we should see that that is now getting modified to have these branches. So right now it's kind of set up to look a little bit like a feather. If I grab the branch spline modifier, you'll see we've got a bunch of different settings. We tried to keep it as clean as possible, but also make it as powerful as possible. A couple basic things. We got the count. We can crank up the count, make as many of these as we like. And we can also make as few as we like. I'm going to pull this way down, and let's just make something practical right away. Let's make a tree is what I'm aiming for. So let's start with our placement. We don't want, the original spline. We'll treat that like the trunk of the tree. So if I grab the start and I start dragging it up, you can see that the original helix is traveling up, and then we'll start doing these branches. Let's say we'll do 3 different sets of branches, and we're saying 2 and 2, so there'll always be a split of 2. And right now you see it's pretty flat, but if we go into our initial direction, we can say, hey, randomly spin those around. So now you can see that we've got a bunch of random branches there. And I'll set the length to not be absolute, but be relative. So now it's the same length as the spline they're spawning off of, but I can shrink those down. We'll add a little length variation. And let's put a little extra spread on there. We could add some random spread. And let's move, actually we'll go into direction and add some gravity. So I'll crank up some gravity here. You see it starts wilting down a little bit. So there we go. We got 1 layer of branches to go along with this tree. So now here's where the power of this comes in. If I take our branch spline modifier and duplicate it, so I'm holding down Command or Control, make a second copy, so you can see how this could start layering up. So now our branches have branches, but let's duplicate that again. And now our branches have branches have branches. We could go a 4th layer there. So now our branches have branches have branches. And at any point we can go back and modify them. In fact, why don't we grab all of them and do things like, say, add a bunch of random angles. Well, we can change a bunch of things. Let's go back to the base properties and we can say, hey, let's have these all bend. And you see we get this nice coherence on everything. So now we can say that all of them should be only bending a little bit from their original angle. And we can say, no, they all bend like way down, have them point straight outward. There we got all these different branches. We can add more random variation onto them, make the whole thing a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. You see each layer shrinking based on the one before. Now, let's move into our direction. And inside of here, we've got we've got how many subdivisions happen. Each of these branches is made up of 10 subdivisions. And now we can randomly have those twist around a little bit. So I'm thinking let's add a whole bunch of random angle variation, and we'll add a whole bunch of random roll variation, and you can see we get this crazy twisted tree, every separate layer twisting up. So love that type of thing. On top of that, we got the gravity. Right now it's all pulling down a bit, but let's not pull down. We can even go negative, so we'll say negative gravity, and now everything's going to want to pull up a little bit. Now we get this completely different looking tree. We could get rid of all that variation. We could do just a little bit of variation on each one, so you see them twisting just a bit. So you get all these different cool layouts, so much different power built directly in here. We have different random seeds, so we can have these lay out and randomly get placed in different directions. We have these relative direction settings, and man, there's so many different things that we can do with this setup. I'll just show a couple other things because I feel like this is actually one of the coolest things that you're going to be able to get access to when it comes to 2024.2 of just like the raw power, and I'm so excited to show more of this off. This is all a bunch of these branches layering up on top of that single helix. But let's say that you wanted to maybe put some flowers on the tip of that or get some leaves on it, but you want that to be a separate object. Right now, this would be all one object that you could render as a single spline, or you could do a sweep, but it's not going to be controlling any of the thickness. But what I'm going to do is take the end result of all of this. So let's just make an instance of it. And so now here's just a copy of that original spline. Now I'll make a brand new branch spline modifier, drop it on. And so essentially now our branches have branches have branches based on this new setting. So I'll just change a few things for us. Let's say that I'm going to do a count of just 1, but we'll do, let's say 7, but randomly between 7 and 11 branches. And let's say they will fan out a whole bunch, and they should be nowhere near as long. So let's just do an absolute scale or absolute length of 10. So now you can see that I was able to grow these extra branches. Actually, I'm going to take all these and put them right to the very tip of the branches. So now you can see I got this nice flare out of essentially these flowers on the tips of this plant. So if I grab my original helix, I could say, hey, change this to be automatic color, and we'll set this to be, I don't know, some nice pink flowers there. So those are now pink. The important thing to note is I should go into my branch spline modifier and go under global and say, don't keep the original. So if I get rid of that, now it's only returning these flower tips instead of the entire plant. So now I've got a completely separate series of flowers all set up on the tree separately, ready to be cloned onto or sweep or do anything that we like with that. But it can get even more powerful than that. So here's a demo I really like doing. So right now we're cloning all of these directly onto this helix. But what I'm going to do is make a brand new helix. So let's make another one, lay this flat on the ground again, make the start radius really small, but we'll make this other one bigger, and I'll lay the whole thing flat on the ground. So that is now just a different helix. So what if we were to grab a brand new branch spline modifier and drop it inside, and now you can see that that is what's growing it. Actually, why don't we turn this whole thing off, everything else? So now there's new branches coming off that helix. I'm going to say, okay, branch spline modifier, don't keep the original. So now we just get those new branches. And I'll say, instead of you initially being born aligned to the spline, I'll say I want you to be up on Y plus. So now they all aim upward. I'll say instead of there being two branches, I'll say there's only one branch. And instead of having any initial angle, we'll just zero that out. And we'll say you're a length of 200. So now we've got all these different branches traveling around randomly. I can change the count here, make as many or as few as I want. We could say that each one is going to have some length variation to be a little bit different. And of course, we can go back in the global and put some random variation in the way that these are angled and twisted and growing. So what do we got now? Well, instead of having a single trunk of a tree, we've now got many. So here's my thought. What if we steal this very first branch spline modifier and we turn it on here? Now we get a series of branches. And now what if we take the next one and turn that on? Now our branches get branches. Grab the next one and the next one. And our branches get branches, and we'll do it one last time. Now we've got a series of trees that are all doing that. And if we update our instance to instead be viewing this helix instead of the other one, I should be able to turn this on. It's going to start getting pretty heavy because we're making so many copies, but now we should be able to get a whole bunch of leaves cloned onto, or flowers cloned onto the tips of each of those trees. Like, it's so crazy, and it's so much fun to layer this up. And here's an entire forest being generated. Just so it goes a little bit faster, I'm going to turn off some of that stuff, and let's go back to the original branches and say, hey, I would like there to be more of them. So now we get more trees traveling along. And because a whole bunch of the subsequent branches that I designed, I said have them be relative to the whatever comes before it, I can go back to this original trunk and we can start modifying that. We've got this lovely start end length. So if I start saying like, hey, I want you to shrink near the start and then get bigger at the end, you see that these trees actually get bigger as they get near the middle. Or we can pull it the opposite direction and they'll be small in the middle and large on the outside. So we can, we could change variation on the placement so they're randomly spread along there. So once again, an entire forest, we can grab all these different properties all at the same time. And again, do things like, let's put some normal gravity. We could all make them very kind of mechanical looking and not so random, like these very straight leaves. And at any point, go and reintroduce putting those flowers on the tips of each of them. All of it completely parametric controllable. Nothing's been made editable. So I absolutely love this tool. There are so many more things that you can do with this. This is just scratching the surface. The way of showing off a couple other little things, I'll just open up a new scene file. And actually here you get all the different previews, example scene files of things that we've made. So if I double click on this one, you can see here's a very simple kind of graphic looking thing where if we hit play, we get this kind of random branches all traveling around doing their thing, looking all spiky. This one I really like. Double click on this. And this is showing a whole bunch of different fractal kind of mechanical uses of branch. So this is all branch. Here you can just see these are all parametric splines. So usually I just start with a helix spline to have something. So here's a very kind of mathematical tree where each thing is like 75% of the previous one. Here's the same idea, but very two-dimensional. So we get this 2D fractal tree. If I were to twirl this down and select all of the children here, you see they all have identical properties. So it's kind of like by layering them up and having the same thing, it becomes very fractal. So here we have the ability to grab our rotation, and you see as I drag it that all of them are going to be animating the exact same way, twisting to a new position, creating this cool fractal look. And here's what's cool is if I keep on pushing that far enough, you're eventually going to see, there's a lot of randomness I built in there, but you start seeing a similar pattern right here. This one just has even less randomness where you get all these different layers of kind of this bracket and the bracket and the bracket. So if I open that one up, maybe I'll speed it up just a little bit by turning off the last layer. So if I select all of those and again start modifying this angle, there's a lot of them, so it's going to not go super fast, but you see how each of those is rotating. Like, look how cool that is. I'm so excited for all the cool, crazy things we're going to be able to make here. So very similar idea over here, just kind of with a triangle, kind of making this fractal mobile, each one going down smaller and smaller, just for fun. Why don't I go inside that one and we can, as simple as grabbing this final modifier, hold down Control, make a duplicate, and now you see there's another layer of them going even one level deeper. So it just keeps on going further and further. And finally, let's open up this branch modifier example file where I am generating an entire parametric rose bush. I guess almost entirely parametric. The actual rose flower here isn't, but if you've ever played around inside the models folder, you can go and search for the word rose, and we're going to have a whole bunch of different things like rose bushes and rose plants. So I actually grabbed one of these rose plants, probably this one right here, and that is literally sitting right there. That's one of those rose plants. So that's an example I based it off of. So all I did is took that rose head, and then I used branch and I layered them up, and you see it all layered up here where I exploded them out, kind of like how I showed those flowers or the leaves, exploded that as a separate object. So here I have the stem being its own object based off of the spawn spline. And then I am making an instance of it and then branching more things off and branching more things off. So if we go back to this main stem, I can grab this branch modifier and say, hey, just give me one. And you can see I've now got a single branch of this rose. I can now say, hey, start increasing the length of it. And what's cool here is just the way it's set up with percentages, it's going to keep on creating more rose flowers and more branches. So I can keep on pushing that further and further. We can make it really small, go back and say, hey, there should be 2 or 3 or 4, and randomly place these. At any point, grabbing just this one, which is the main stem, go into direction, and here's the gravity. So right now gravity is pulling down. But let's say gravity of 0, so now it'll be more random. Gravity of -20, so now it's going to want to go more vertical and clump them up a little bit more. Things go even further where you can even say, hey, I want this to be a spherical gravity, and it's actually going to be aiming towards wherever I move this object. Now, right now, its gravity pushes away by default. So let's say that this is actually a positive one. So I'll say, give me 50%. And now you see it's actually going to aim towards wherever I drag this. So now we get this clustering that we could actually animate in this very clean, coherent way. So this stuff gets absolutely crazy. Let's just go back to global, let those do what they want to do. Layer each of these up. And again, we can go one layer deeper. So here's where the rose is growing from, so we can grab that layer and say that that one should be longer. So now the branch that the rose grows off of, each of them broken out into their own thing. And it even goes to here, each of these leaves is just another layer of branch. That is not something I'm cloning. I'm actually spawning different leaves, like a series of branches right here. Let's see, yeah, here's the leaflets, and these are growing different bits of leaves, and then they get swept, and then I get material applied to them. So there is so much fun and power, and even I don't know all the things that this branch tool can do. So I really look forward to seeing how people end up using this, making all sorts of cool, crazy parametric like growth things where imagine you could be doing like neurons and feathers and plants and lightning strikes, and there's so many different things you might be able to grow from this. And the fact that it's like pretty dang coherent all the way through the process of being able to modify any one of these, just very, very exciting. So look forward to hearing about people playing with this. If you make anything cool, please like tag me on social media, because I would love to see any end results that come from that. Or if you have any suggestions for ways it might be able to be modified in the future. So I hope you are all as excited about the branch spline modifier as I am, but there is one final topic to tackle to wrap this up, and that is going to be the changes and improvements to the scene nodes. This should be pretty straightforward. Into a new scene file, go into the asset browser. If you've been using any of Rocket Lasso's nodes or any of the geometry modifier nodes, things like that, the behavior that they used to have is every time you opened up an old scene file, it would take any of the nodes or any of the tools that we made and always update it to the newest version. Now, obviously, if you're working on a project for a client, or if you have changes, you don't want it changing automatically. So, and even though we're trying to keep everything as compatible as possible, now when you load up a scene file, it is not going to automatically jump to the newest one. You'll see here is my trim spline modifier, and it's been updated and fixed a few times. And if you look at this dropdown, you're going to see that there's a bunch of different versions. In the past, it would always jump to the newest version, but now when it opens up the scene file, it's going to remember what version it was created in. Now you can choose when it's going to update. Also, the nodes will warn you if something's missing when you're saving your file, when you're opening the file. If suddenly something's not there, it's going to give you a heads up about that. For the most part, for the average user, you can just go and use these tools, and it's going to be a more seamless workflow for you. So that's a big positive across the board. Now, let's change my layout. I'm going to jump to my nodes layout. And a couple new nodes have been added inside of Neutron, or inside of the scene nodes. So let me make a plane, and this is just a node-based primitive. output that into the scene. So there's a plane. Now, inside of nodes has been added the thicken modifier. So there's a nodes-based version of that. So I can interrupt this wire here. And now you can see I've added thickness to that plane. So pretty handy there. Next up, let me create a cone and drop that cone in there. And this one, you can see that there has been an addition of the symmetry object. So we got that new powerful symmetry that is now existing also as a node. Again, interrupt. Let's tell it to mirror on the Y. We can change the offset of that. And now we can parametrically mirror things inside of nodes. So very handy there. A couple other nodes for people who are actually creating these capsules. There is now a pop element node, which can be pretty handy. And there has been a workflow improvement in regards to the geometry property get and set, where it's going to be a little bit easier to jump. It's got better defaults. You get access to the information a little bit easier. So some slight tweaks to that. And lastly, if we go back to standard layout, there is now, let's go to a new scene file. There is now a new node, which is also able to be dragged out as a modifier, and it is the resample node. So this is a way of resampling splines. So I'll drag this in under a spline, and we've got a couple different properties here. We change the overall count of the spline. You see as I decrease this, we have fewer and fewer points making up that spline. And you can do things like change the step, so we can have it based on the step. Now, of course, this is replicating some functionality of a Rocket Lasso tool, and I will definitely defend the Rocket Lasso version. If you don't know, and under extensions, here's my tool, Rocket Lasso Utility Splines. This actually creates 5 different tools for you, and one of them is resample. If I were to remake the resample, here's some reasons I love our version. First of all, you can double click on the icon. It's going to show you a preview of where it put all the new points, which is great. I mean, you also get like 5 different tools with it. This is just one of them. And we can do things like change our step mode to increase or decrease that. We see the tick marks, actually see where they are. We can change it to count or random step or subdivide. And we can do things like retain the original points and snap the points to be very even or have the leftover. So lots of different controls there. So I definitely like the way we've got our tool. But yeah, there's now the resample node, which is going to make it nice for us to be able to make additional tools inside of the capsules. So it's always really exciting to see the new things that we will be able to make new tools that you don't need to be a TD to use. You can just pop open our tool and go and tackle them. So very excited for the possibilities in the future of additional tools we'll be able to make. So thank you as always for watching the video. If you're interested in supporting Rocket Lasso, obviously you can hit the subscribe button here so you can catch all the videos as we release them. And also you can support on Patreon, where I'm going to include a bunch of the scene files I used here, including that wood shader from Substance that I created a couple years ago, just in case you want to play around with it. So anyway, that'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.